Well, good morning to all. Let me say thank you again to Eleanor for sharing such an incredible, dynamic, and very personal story, and for really setting the stage for the kind of conversation that I'm hoping that we're going to have here. The question here is whether or not we want more than a seat at the table in terms of patient centricity, if what we really want is to create a culture of patient engagement. So we have a very exciting panel here this morning to help us address some of these very important issues. I was asked to make a couple of comments. Then I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves and to themselves make some brief 2 to 3 minute comments to just get us started and set the stage. And then hopefully we'll have a rousing conversation with you. So every time I talk about patient engagement, I can't help but say out loud Sharon Terry's comment to me one day. She leaned over and said, "You know what? We've been talking about patient engagement for about 20 years now. When are we going to get married?" So when are we going to get married? When are we going to change the idea of episodic interfaces, asking questions, and actually create a full-on relationship that allows us to transform the research and development ecosystem? When will that happen? And what will it take to have that happen? Where are we along the journey right now? And what is the gap between where we can agree we want to be and where we stand today? What are the kinds of tools and processes that we'll need to have in place? What is the culture shift that needs to happen in order for us to be full-on engaged, to have patients at the center, at the front end, in every part of the work that we do every day? How do we transform people from occasional participants in the clinical trial or the trial or science paradigm to citizen scientists who are helping us think about things, craft the research that needs to happen, focuses on what they need as outcomes, and then deliver it? How does that change occur? Eleanor also reminded me of something I had the occasion to talk about a week ago, which is the idea that although shift sounds sudden, it is often the long view that allows us to really create lasting change. So many people believe that, you know, it'll happen in a moment, and there are pivotal moments, those ahas that Eleanor referred to, that each of us have had, where we start to define ourselves or our work, or a notion comes to us about how important it is to incorporate the views of patients in what we do every day. But then it's the long road from that to the actual change that we get to live every day. I'd like to give 2 examples, aha moments for me. My first aha moment on patient engagement came when I was probably too young to know what it was. My uncle, who was a paraplegic at the hands of polio in 1925, came to live with us when I was born, not 1925. And having him in our home taught many, many lessons, and he lived with us until I was 13 years old. It taught that it was give and receive when you were caring for someone with a serious illness. And it also showed me the power of his insights, his persistence, his tone, things that he could know about himself, defining his needs that no one else around him could know. It also helped me understand the power of caregivers and giving and the insights that they can provide. I knew at 7 and 8 years old, when I was helping to care for him, some things he didn't even know about himself, patterns that he couldn't have noticed himself, but we around him noticed. I noticed things about him when I went to lace up his shoes and his back brace so that he could come upstairs and spend his day. So the power of patient insight, of caregiving insight, landed on me probably far before I knew what that meant. But it crystallized for me just a couple of years ago when I was at the National Children's Hospital talking to a physical therapist. She was showing me some new technology that was absolutely amazing. And she was telling me about how she measured range of motion in young boys that she was treating using video games interactively. How she measured that range of motion in a more natural environment and felt that the meaningfulness of it was better. She also asked me on that day why we insisted on using the outcomes measurements we did for muscular dystrophy. I asked her why she asked that question, what's wrong with the ones? She said, you know what? Because what I hear from the parents and the boys themselves is that they don't really care about that outcome. Many of them can't even apply. They haven't been out of their wheelchairs in years, some of them. But what does matter to them is how quickly and accurately they could type on their iPads, because it's how they do their homework and how they talk to their friends and how they entertain themselves. But that's not something that we measured. So again, the insights from patients and parents and caregivers landed on me like a ton of bricks, things that we miss in our everyday pursuit of high science, of moving therapies forward. And so I think that there's an opportunity for us to do a few things this morning, and I hope we will. First is maybe define and get some agreement on what is patient engagement and centricity and centeredness and all the other terms that we use. How are we going to measure those outcomes? And then to talk a little bit about what it's going to take us to move ahead in this very important and dynamic space. So, with that as a backdrop, I'm going to ask that we start at this end, and I'll have the panelists just introduce themselves briefly, and then to take a moment to kind of level set for us so that we can get this party started.
Good morning. I'm Debbie Brooks. I'm co-founder and executive vice chairman at the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Our organization has been around for about 16 years, and I think that makes us somewhat young, but we've learned a lot about what it takes to play a role in speeding drug development and better treatments for a community. And I think we are learning every day. As an organization founded by a patient, I like to think that we're always patient-centric and patient-engaged. But I do think that the terminology and the role we're playing even in our own disease keeps evolving. And so for us, as we've worked to speed drug development, we have focused a lot on trying to get the patients involved as a peer in the process. So I think certainly for the first decade, that had a lot to do with having patients' unmet needs confirmed and on the table in terms of drug development priorities. It has focused on bringing patient capital into the process, which we believe passionately has a different risk and reward profile, and so they will take the long view, or we can do things that other big funders may not be willing to do, and we can complement their work. We also have done work to bring patients into the research process directly and build on-ramps and tools so that we could use patient information and patient contributions into traditional science and, excuse me, as well as patient-reported outcomes that could help us better understand disease and understand the potential benefit of therapies. I think for us, we're still learning about the concepts of patient centrality, which I think is a more formalized way in which we can quantify the patient needs and patient priorities and patient responses as we move, hopefully, more and more things into commercialization and through the regulatory process and in interactions with payers. And so I think even for us within the organization, we're evolving excuse me, our concept of what patient engagement and patient centrality means.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Adrian Hernandez, a cardiologist from Duke University. So in some ways, I'm part of the problem in a way in terms of being part of these ivory tower institutions. And my story started off a number of years ago when we were starting to think about a study in stroke. And so we had developed this great resource following a bunch of people who've had strokes and their survivorship and what was happening to them. And we were thinking about doing a study in terms of understanding what would be the best for stroke survivors. And so we had some of the greatest thought leaders about this, and so there was a lot of debate about what to do there, and we couldn't come to agreement. We thought that there was certain outcomes that are really important, certain therapies are really important, but we really couldn't come to agreement. And so we decided to, well, let's just ask the stroke survivors. Maybe they actually know what they care about. And so we did that. And so we actually went through this and we presented to them that here are the things that we thought are important. Here are the different therapies that we think are important to study. And here are the outcomes that we think are the most important. Actually, at the time, we weren't thinking, we said we know are the most important based on our conversations among thought leaders. And so they basically told us we had it completely wrong. That there are certain areas that we were interested in studying that actually didn't matter to them. The answer was already there for them. That didn't matter. And then the outcomes that we were focused on, such as survival, that was important, but what's more important was time at home. So how many days at home did they have that were of quality? And so we actually wind up having to come together and put together a new outcome that had not really been well studied, and we created an outcome called home time. And so while it drove our statisticians completely nuts, because it was not going to be an easy outcome to analyze, that's what we said that they wanted, and so that's what we went with. And so the story continued on where we brought some of our patient partners to Duke in a big research conference that's full of researchers, and the room's full of half cardiologists, and did a panel like this. And one of them, when I started the conversation, said, why are you here? That's a long trip from Buffalo. Why come here? And she said that when she had her stroke and she was getting questioned, actually she characterized it as interrogated about why she had her stroke, because she had a valve, she was on a blood thinner Coumadin, and her cardiologist was interrogating her, that's her word, of why she wasn't compliant. And so she was saying, well, it's not that I wasn't compliant. Maybe I had a bad drug. Maybe it doesn't work for me. Maybe I was doing everything possible, but for whatever reason, it wasn't working for me. So my question, and she was saying to her question to the cardiologist was, why aren't you helping me as opposed to interrogating me? And so across the room, she basically said her number one problem was all the cardiologists. And so that got everyone's attention. And so as we've gone forward, we've incorporated patients at the beginning because for different studies that they help us form the questions, actually tell us what the outcomes matter, and then actually start telling us how to do the studies, like what works in their lives, because we were used to doing studies that are at the convenience of sites, investigators, and so we have people coming in donating their information as opposed to going to them to ask for their help and engaging them. And so now we've moved forward where we're incorporating people and their views at the beginning and actually helping design and conduct the studies, even things like the informed consent, even things about how to approach IRBs. And so that's become a hallmark of what we're doing now.
Thank you. Julie?
Good morning. I'm Julie Gerberding. I'm an executive vice president at Merck and Merck's first patient officer. So as chief patient officer, I'm the first to admit I have a lot to learn, but I'm very excited about the journey that we're on. My personal story really goes back to San Francisco General at the very beginning of the HIV epidemic, when my most important teachers were my patients, because they were far more informed about AIDS and its management than I was at the beginning of the epidemic. And when you're dealing with a disease that has no treatment, and at that time had 100% fatality, you learn to see the world through your patient's eyes very quickly. And there's no silver lining to AIDS, but I'm so grateful for the experience that I had as a young doctor, because it really helped shape my whole understanding of the relationship between the provider and the patient, what it means to really co-collaborate in designing a care plan, often orchestrating a good death, and what it means to bring the family and the caretakers and the loved ones into the picture as you're making those kinds of very complex and heart-wrenching decisions. So that was a very good training ground for understanding what patient centricity was all about. Kind of fast forward to Merck, where we're founded on a core value in the company that George Merck articulated many decades ago, which is we try to remember that medicine is for the patients. We try never to forget that it's for the people, and when we've remembered that, the profits have never failed to occur. But how we manifest that focus on patients has changed throughout our history. And I think where we are today is really recognizing the incredible power of the patient and their caretakers in a really positive and wonderful way. For one thing, our science is in a place that it hasn't been before, where we can really think about cures for diseases that 10 years ago even were unimaginable. But we also can do that with a precision and a much better understanding of the biology of what we're dealing with, and bringing the patients into that environment and learning with them. The N of 1 trials, the ability to really focus not just the end result on a population of patients, but the process on a one of patients, is just really a remarkable phase of our overall evolution as a pharmaceutical innovator and a patient-centric organization. Our journey is really at the beginning. We're learning inside the organization. It does take a culture change, but we're also learning outside the organization, and the kinds of evolution that's going on at the FDA and 21st Century Cures, and the incredible sophistication and expansion of the advocacy community, the caretaker community, has really, I think, created one of the most exciting opportunities in medicine. So I'm just thrilled to be here. I look forward to our discussion and for getting a chance to know many of you as the days go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie?
Good morning. My name is Julie Fleshman. I'm the president and CEO of the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. I was hired 16 and a half years ago as the first employee of the organization after my father in 1999 was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was 52 years old, and the doctors told him there was nothing that could be done, that he should go home and get his affairs in order. And he died 4 months later from his disease. And I was mad. I couldn't understand why we were given no options and why nobody could imagine a different outcome. And that's really what's driven my passion at the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. I didn't choose or plan to become an advocate, as Eleanor said earlier. That path sort of, I was led down that path because of the experience with my dad. And I think the number one thing I've taken away from the last 16 years in this community and this field is that it's the patient's story and the patient's voice that brings the sense of urgency to what we are all doing. And that sense of urgency at the end of the day, I think, is what inspires people to act, whether that's Congress or researchers or industry or funders. That sense of urgency is really critically important for moving faster than we're moving today. And that when you then, as a patient advocate, can combine sort of that sense of urgency and those stories with meaningful data and services and programs and the patient experience, I think then we become an invaluable partner that has to be at the table, that it really can't move forward without us there. And every day I feel like the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network gets closer to being sort of that invaluable partner that needs to be at the table. But I also think as we do that, we risk actually becoming less disruptive and more a part of the establishment. And that's a fine line that I think patient advocacy organizations have to walk every single day. How do we be that partner that everyone wants at the table, has to have at the table, but we're still being disruptive and demanding change and sort of bringing that sense of urgency? And I think we're still figuring out exactly what that looks like. And I was reminded again this last weekend, sort of this sense of urgency. My aunt's sister's husband was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 5 weeks ago. I helped them find, you know, the specialist and the phase 3 clinical trial and sort of all the things, all the check boxes that I felt good that, okay, they're in the right place. And the time frame that it took to get him to the doctor, to get the test done, and the paperwork ended up being a 4-week time period for a metastatic stage 4 pancreatic cancer patient. And by the end, he was too sick to be put on treatment, and he died this last Saturday, 5 weeks after diagnosis, without having had any treatment. And I sort of look at that and say, after 16 years of dedicated, passionate work, bringing a sense of urgency to this, is that where we've come to? And so it certainly has raised my game to remember the sense of urgency and that we have to change outcomes, and how to do that in this much larger, more complex system that doesn't always have the same sense of urgency.
Thank you. Okay.
Good morning. I'm Katie O'Callahan. I work at the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA is one of those agencies that is filled with dedicated professionals who come to work every day to protect and promote the public health. Yet unfortunately, typically attention is paid when we've done something wrong or missed something. So it's really been an honor for me to work in the patient engagement space at FDA, which is helping not only the FDA employees to have a better understanding and appreciation for the experience of patients with diseases and conditions, but also to see and feel more directly the impact of the work that they do. So part of what we're talking about today on this panel is creating a culture of patient engagement. So I'll talk a little bit about the FDA as an organization and how it's been going through a culture change or a culture shift to more embrace patient engagement. So our experience with patients in the advocacy world really came to the forefront with the HIV/AIDS and cancer patients coming to the agency and demanding that we consider their tolerance for risk, recognizing that for these patients, particularly where they have unmet needs and progressive conditions, that the standards and the level of evidence that we were demanding was too high or not flexible enough to consider what patients were actually experiencing. And this was a real aha moment for the entire organization. You know, a realization that, perfect evidence is completely unrealistic and not reflective of the experience of regular clinical practice, but of course of patients' experiences. So for decades now, the agency has included patient representatives as members of our advisory committees, but we realize that, that's a great thing to do, but we need to do more. So, I think part of the sense of urgency for the agency has been an increasing realization that the role of patients and the role of patient organizations has fundamentally shifted in the decades since the HIV/AIDS and cancer patients came to the agency demanding that we listen to their voice. That continues to be a key role that patients and patient organizations play, of course. But I think there's been an appreciation that with the internet age, patients are empowered with information in a way they never were before. Patients truly are experts in their conditions and their experience of their conditions, more so oftentimes than the true quote-unquote experts in those conditions, and we learn a lot when we listen to them. I think there's also been an appreciation that patient organizations are moving closer and closer to the actual work of finding cures, of creating the right evidence, of creating the infrastructure, of looking at clinical trials and research in a completely different way than we used to do before, where we have the ability to get information and input from patients when we're designing the devices, the discovery, the clinical trials, the way we communicate the information from the beginning to the end. And so at FDA, I work in the Center for Devices. I'm going to ask you all to humor me in a quick audience poll. I think everyone knows about drugs and food. We experience these regularly. Devices are things like, raise your hand if you or a family member has had a coronary stent implanted. Keep them up. Angioplasty, artificial hip or knee or ankle or shoulder. Okay. What about LASIK? Keep them up. X-ray, MRI, ultrasound, blood sent to a lab for diagnosis. Okay, so those are all medical devices. So, we have a challenge where oftentimes patients don't think about devices in the same way that they think about drugs. Certainly when you take a drug, you're asking your doctor, what side effects might I have? Has this been studied in patients like me? Do we know what's going to happen? Is this going to work for me? And so on. And so with medical devices, we've really been working with the industry as well as patients to look at how we can better incorporate patient input even at the design stage. Well, that's one of the benefits of the device development life cycle, is that they're actually designed. So we can take that input and design a better device in the first place that takes patient input into account. So at CDRH, we have the Center for Devices at FDA. We have embraced patient engagement, and partnering with patients is one of our strategic priorities for the organization. So for the 2016-17 time period, the entire organization is focused on a variety of activities under two spheres. One is the art of patient engagement, and the second is the science of patient input. And you really need both of these together to do it right. And so we're doing a number of things in the patient engagement sphere to learn more about the patient experience and provide that exposure to our staff. But we're also taking it the next step and making sure that we're actually using it in our decisions, and we're advancing the science of things like patient preferences and patient-reported outcomes so that we can integrate this into our decisions just like we would with clinical data or any other data that we're looking at when evaluating these technologies.
Thank you, Katie. Julie, can I come back to you for a minute, because you gave me chills and gave me pause when you talked about your recent family experience. And 16 years in, this is apparently not where you want it to be. But 16 years from now, if you wanted to have one of those drop the mic moments of, I'm good, I'm done, this is it, exactly what I was hoping for, what would that look like?
So the survival rate for this disease needs to change. We need to move the needle. It can't just be about we've funded more research grants and we've put more patients on trials and we've raised more money and sort of all of those metrics that are important, and we certainly have lots of them to be very proud of. But we need to move the needle on outcomes. And to me, it significantly moved the needle on outcome. So to me, that's what it's all about. We need to change the 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer.
That'll do it. Anybody else want to, kind of vision where do we see industry, academia? Do you have different feelings for Parkinson's?
I think that for us, I would really, and I think we're getting close to this being possible sooner than we'd imagine. I'd like us to have something that goes beyond treating the symptoms and helping some of the people manage some of the symptoms some of the time. And breaking through into anything that could be disease modifying has a lot of challenges. But with the revolution in genetics, in particular for Parkinson's in the last 10 years, we have a whole new group of targets that have been illuminated. And the patients can be playing a really important role now to help us understand how to pair those new targets with abilities to measure whether new drug innovation can be tested in humans. And so, trying to get better understand and define the heterogeneity of the disease, coming up with measures, but all those things really in service of getting something that's disease modifying for the patient community, something that could slow, stop, reverse, ultimately prevent the disease, which we just see on a continuum going beyond the ability to manage symptoms.
So I completely agree, outcomes matter. And one thing though is that outcomes is plural, that for a certain group of people or a patient or a person or my mother, there are different outcomes that matter, and it's not necessarily just a single outcome. And so in terms of 15 years, how do we improve a range of outcomes? And so it's not just life expectancy, but actually how they feel, are they doing better, are they doing more than what they want? And then also to get there, thinking about 5-year increments. We have all these walls around data and the patient's data and what they want it to be used for. And there's so many different things that could be done if we allowed an easier fashion for patients to have their data, to share it, to donate it, to link it, to be able to be used for clinical trials, to be part of that system and actually be enable that as opposed to building walls around that. And so right now, and this is coming from an institutional perspective, we've created all these walls on the behalf of protecting patients. And the patients, at least that when we do surveys, et cetera, and hear their voice, they're saying those walls aren't protecting them.
That's a great point.
I would just add, because first of all, the sense of urgency really resonates with me, but I think we need to go deep in the science, and that means we truly need to have foundational understanding of the pathogenesis of many of these conditions that right now we don't have solutions to. But I also think we have to go wide. Many of us here focus primarily on the US, and yet the diseases that we're interested in are universal problems around the world. So we have to think about how do we mobilize and take action that has meaning and value for the totality of the patient collection, not just the people who are lucky enough to live in an environment where they have strong advocacy groups and support from caretakers and the regulatory process.
And Katie, do you have a, kind of a regulatory perspective on where you'd like to see us in, let's call it 10 years' time?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, in 2 years' time, or at the end of our 2-year stretch for the strategic priorities, we hope that we will have created the foundation for a true culture of patient engagement at the agency. Because we think we're creating this guiding coalition, this army of volunteers who's truly embracing patient engagement at the agency, and what that will do in the variety of diseases and conditions where we see technology being developed, I don't even think I can imagine, and it'll be exciting to see. One of the things that we did at the agency was, or at the center with this strategic priority, was not to define what meaningful engagement was for our staff, but rather to ask them to tell us what would be meaningful. Recognizing that as part of this organizational shift, we really needed to effectively engage our workforce in this effort. And that if we told them, it would be something that was being pushed from the leadership or what have you. But so what we did was we put together a series of competitive contests for intramural grants, collaborative grants, around patient science and patient engagement. And we asked staff to tell us, if we could figure out the logistics and provide you the support, what do you wish you could learn? What questions do you have? What answer do you wish you knew from patients? If patient engagement is the answer, sort of the putting the answer out there first, you tell us what question this tells you. We have had an enormous groundswell of participation and engagement by the staff. They've come up with questions we never would have come up with ourselves had we gone about this in another way. And I think one of the most important indicators of the success of this approach has been that over 90% of our staff, so over 60% of our staff this year have had a direct interaction with a patient. Over 90% of them are saying this is highly meaningful, and over 80% are saying this is relevant to their work. And so it's really changing their appreciation, their understanding of the patient experience. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of that. What I think this will do in 10 years, I think we will start to see not just the agency, but organizations throughout this ecosystem that we're all a part of, coming up with all kinds of different ways of making sure that the patient, yes, has a seat at the table, that we're listening to their voice, but going beyond that and truly integrating the input, maybe designing clinical trials differently in the way that Adrian's been seeing successes, but across the board. Maybe improving the way we communicate. I think, with one of the most humbling learnings I've had at the agency is how heterogeneous or variable the data are, right? How variable the response is to this treatment or that treatment. And I think the better we are at communicating that information, asking patients what's most important to you, the better we are able to, make sure that patients' preferences and values are taken into consideration and that we choose the best course of action for them.
So you all feel free to hop in, because I'm going to toss out the idea that processes, tools, ways to implement. Adrian, you started talking about data sharing platforms. You just talked about some processes that had been integrated into the work. So, what are some of the tools that let's start with the tools that we have, and then we'll come back and say, okay, so what's missing? So what do we have that's best practice?
So I'll just give one example over the last couple of years that's been in the building fashion, but now is in the complete launch mode, and that's PCORnet. And so this is an effort funded by PCORI to bring together patients, clinicians, health systems, their electronic health data together in a way that drives research in a better, cheaper, faster way for the outcomes that matter. And through that, the electronic health data has been mapped to a common data model that can be used. There are platforms to promote engagement of patients and their groups. There are a variety of people-powered research networks that are integrated into PCORnet. And so those are platforms that can be used now. Now, it's not to say that the work's done, because we're finding each step of the way that we find an institutional wall that we're having to kind of crack through. And we're doing that over time, and we're accelerating that, but it needs to go even faster.
Adrian and I are, if you wonder why we're smiling at each other, we worked together at PCORI on this, and I had brown hair when we started. It's
I'm
really,
getting great now. Okay.
I know, he's right behind me on this one. So it's, quite a task to identify the opportunities and then, hop some of the barriers. So thank you for raising that one. And then, Deborah?
I think one of the things we've witnessed is, starting again with there's a little of irony in this. Parkinson's disease is a community that you're trying to mobilize, and it is a disease that literally leaves people immobile. And then you have symptoms of the disease that are about anxiety or about just trying to bring the patient into the conversation. And we've had to do quite a bit of work just to educate the Parkinson's patients about their disease. They are a community not seen commonly by a specialist, as 60% of patients aren't seeing the right doctors. And so you've got your patient community spread out, and you don't really have the kind of care network that you'd like to see. So education became such an important role for us, and that kind of surprised us. We didn't really think of ourselves in the patient education business, but it turns out when you want to be in the patient engagement business and drawing people into the scientific process and the research process, it became required. And we started doing some work to support clinical trial recruitment. And we found that we started really around one big trial where we needed newly diagnosed patients who weren't on medications. And that was a group that our organization really didn't know. People would come to us over time, but not necessarily the day they were diagnosed. And that was such a short window to get people involved in an observational study to better understand the progression markers of the disease potentially. And so in this notion that, we have to go educate folks, we realized we better build a repository. When folks realize, I'm needed, we're optimistic. We thought, they're gonna say, I didn't realize I was needed. How can I help? And we built a platform that we've relied on now. We have over 60,000 people who've come into our kind of Match.com platform for clinical trial recruitment. And that's 80% of those people have Parkinson's, 20% are either blood relatives and caregivers, other folks who can participate in research. And I think of that as a platform because that really helped us start this conversation about the role that patients can be playing in research. It's evolved because that tool is really one that will help move people into the more traditional clinical trial work in the US and beyond, but we've added onto that platform with a virtual trial called Fox Insight, and I think this is kind of where we see even more possibilities. In Fox Insight, we take deeper profile information, and we're now collecting that longitudinally, so this is patient-reported data, and getting it over time, survey-based. And now we're building a pretty, it's just getting started. We have about 5,000 patients in Fox Insight, and that platform is something that we think can really coalesce patient-reported data for science, hypothesis generating, but also we can quickly now through survey mechanisms go to the patients and ask them questions directly. And so we've been able to see that you can kind of build these centralized places where patients can come together and contribute to a process. I'll give you an example of a recent use of the Fox Insight platform where we had at Vanderbilt, an investigator was looking for some funding from NIH, and they were told to look at whether DBS is something, deep brain stimulation is something that we should be looking at in earlier stage patients. And the NIH was interested in providing the funding for the science, but had a real question of whether patients would even enroll into a study like that. And so that investigator came to us and asked, could we help provide some data to go back to NIH so he could get his grant? And we were able in 2 days to get 300 responses to a survey of early stage patients. Would they be interested in learning more or consider something like DBS in the earliest stages of Parkinson's disease? And with that data, he could go right back to NIH and proceed with getting funding to do that study. And so, you know, there are just a lot of different ways now where I think we can build platforms and consolidate information and use it from everything for hypothesis generating to really understanding the opinions and the interests of the patient community.
You know, there is a culture change involved in this, and you know this better than I do from your work on PCORI, but you know, forever, the biopharmaceutical industry was really thinking mostly about what does the doctor need or want, or how do we influence the physician in their decision making. And you know, this idea that actually it's about what does the patient need or want seems obvious, but actually we're not really designed to build and respect that. So the change that's going on inside of our organizations is actually pretty profound. And you are helping us move in that direction. But just reflecting, a couple weeks ago, we had a all-day meeting on breast cancer inside the company, and we brought people from the outside patients to tell their stories and help the scientists and the people inside the organization get a broader perspective. And what was so amazing about the day was that it was one of the few times I've ever seen the auditorium completely packed. So people who would not normally come and participate in this kind of learning experience were there, and when they left, their motivation and their sense of urgency about what needed to be done inside of the company was transformed. So I'm very optimistic about how we can make this transition, because I think it really appeals to people's inner sense of purpose and why we do the jobs that we do. But it's also true that we do have to change some regulatory surround. It's not just traditional barriers. I mean, there are true regulatory barriers that prevent us from being able to take this to where we ultimately hope it will go.
Give us an example.
Well, for example, there are barriers to what we can communicate to physicians and patients. If it's not in the label, we can't talk about it. Even if we have science and experience and knowledge, or we know something about adverse events that, you know, is relevant to people who are using drugs off-label, there are just many situations where we can't fully share what we know or what the science tells us about medicine. So that's just a small example, but
that's even, I mean, I think that's large. So communication to patients from the beginning through the end. And so just an example we've run into, we're running this study called Adaptable, which is partner with patients. And so our patient partners, they self-name themselves adapters. And so they want to blog about the study. So they want to share their experience with the participants along the way. And they want the participants, if they want to share their experience. And so when we proposed this to one of the IRBs, they said, well, we're going to have to review the blog. And we said, well, there's this thing called the internet. And so it's open, it's going to be public facing, so you can review it like everyone else in the world. And so to get through that, so when you're talking about changing the regulations, exactly right. It's, it's across the various institutions. And so, but I feel like we have a lot of momentum to do that, and we should drive that because the appetite's there. And when you look at hear from institutional leaders, they also are recognizing that too, and so, but they want to have a pathway to change that.
I think it goes even beyond the regulatory process. I mean, we've done some work where we've helped payers really understand the potential impact of new treatments, and again, having a platform where you can go right to the patient community. In one case, we were trying to help payers understand the value to the patient community if they could better manage the on-off phenomena of their drug regimen. And again, just these kind of platforms that are showing such enormous power. Our Facebook community, which has 750,000 members, in less than a month, we put a survey up and got feedback from 3,000 patients who talked about on-off phenomena, and that information, it paired with testimonials from our patient council members, really helped change the view of payers of new potential treatments and what the meaningfulness would be to the patient community. They would, instead of looking at a drug as convenient, because it had a different formulation, they realized that it would be extremely impactful for their day-to-day living.
Julie?
So I think, very similar to Debbie, patients with pancreatic cancer or really any disease that doesn't have very good outcomes have a hard time navigating the system and knowing where to go and what to do. And, if you go to institution X, you're going to get this, and if you go to institution Y, you're going to get this, and that's just because we don't know what the best thing is to do. And so that's a very difficult journey for any patient to navigate. And so we've created a comprehensive patient services called Patient Central, and it's basically a call center where patients and families can call in and get information about the disease, specialists. We've also created a clinical trial tool so patients can find clinical trials that they may be eligible for. And we, this year, will have over 30,000 contacts into our patient services program. So we're talking to more pancreatic cancer patients and families than any other, entity in the world. And that's really given us the foundation to be able to think about where are the gaps, we published a paper on the current clinical trial enrollment rate for pancreatic cancer because that information didn't exist. We didn't think it was good, but we didn't really know what it was. And so now we know what that enrollment rate is, and our goal is to increase it. We published another paper on looking at the landscape of phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials in pancreatic cancer over the last 30 years and looking at what happened. Why have most of those trials failed? And so that information built on sort of a foundation of information that we learn through patients who call us every day has given us now the ability to do much more sophisticated programs and services. We offer a Know Your Tumor, we call it Know Your Tumor, a molecular profiling service for patients and families, and we're collecting data around that, something that wasn't very accepted in this field. And we've just launched a precision medicine clinical trial platform called Precision Promise. And so each of these things sort of builds on the other, but the foundation that I believe allows us to do it and to do it with the right, with the patient's, what the patient's desire is because of this patient services and the number of patients and families that we are talking to every day.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm most excited about as a development in terms of areas that patient groups are getting involved is patient registries, patient group-led registries, direct from patient data. I think what we learn about a given therapy or diagnostic tool in clinical trial for a variety of reasons. The study environment is rigid so that we can control certain variables and then better understand, how much of this is really due to this treatment or what have you. But the trade-off to that is we lose a lot of real-world evidence, if you will, the experience that happens once things go out, to the marketplace. And I think one of the benefits of big data, of the analytics capabilities that we're all developing, but especially of this, this movement of patient-generated data, I think there's enormous promise for us to better understand what's really happening, which patients really benefit, which patients does this not work in. The diversity of experience, I think, is one of the areas I'm really excited to see what we learn, but also what outcomes matter most to patients may differ from this patient to that patient to that patient. And so maybe the benefit-risk trade-off is not worth it for one patient and it is for another. And that kind of information is something I think we will start to be able to better learn from the whole system in ways that will help us better target, the right treatment for you.
You tapped into two things that came to mind as you were talking. The first is the idea of risk-benefit and how that gets assessed and how it gets communicated is an area that we at Pfizer are working on quite aggressively now. For all the reasons that you just stated, it's not necessarily the same for every patient or even the same patient at different points in their disease. And so really getting an understanding of that has been quite critical and quite meaningful. The other thing that I found really interesting and somewhat exciting is the idea that there are different ways that you can engage patients. You can ask them and they will tell you, but also some patients are unable to do so. And having good tools for observation, either with wearables and other dynamic data collection tools that patients are comfortable wearing, helps provide insights that themselves, patients may not be aware of, their caregivers may not be able to observe. And then the other one, we had a quite incredible experience in sickle cell disease where we deployed ethnographers to actually live, if you would, with the patients over hours of the course of the day. And actually what they discovered in that process was quite dynamic, often different than the healthcare provider, the caregiver, or the patient themselves had actually realized was happening in the environment. So that was really telling. So it sounds like we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of best practices. Processes are, kind of moving along in their evolution. So how come we're not where we want to be yet? What? I mean, everybody seems to be working on it. We all happy about it, But what's standing between us and where we, really want to be in this space?
Frida, there are a couple things that I want to make sure that we put into that bucket because, we have lots of different areas of focus in this room, but I think we are united in a commitment to the fact that we do need more discovery research. We need more targets. And if we had more targets, if we really understand disease pathogenesis more clearly and harvest this incredible omic world that we're living in, I guarantee you that the Mercks and Pfizers and GSKs and Sanofis, et cetera, of the world can find drugs or molecules that will be potentially useful. But our limiting step are targets. And so we do need to all stand strong and advocate for funding for basic discovery research at the NIH and through our foundations and through any other pathway that we can encourage to step up and give us something to work with so that we can really move the needle on the dial in terms of drug development. So that's one thing I want to make sure that we stand strong on. I think the other thing you've already talked about, and that is working collaboratively to get patients to understand and value the importance of clinical trials. Because everybody needs patients in their clinical trials, but if we do this together as a movement, I think we can really accelerate the opportunity and shorten some of the development time that, you know, in my world, I like to say when we're sitting around having conference calls or meetings that go on and have to be scheduled 6 weeks from now because so-and-so can't make it, you know, folks, people are dying. Let's step up here and keep the momentum going because people are dying. And we need to bring that urgency into the whole clinical development process.
So I was going to say, I fully agree about the discovery needs. One of the things that also needs to happen to accelerate that is phenotyping in a way. So like, as patients go through the healthcare system right now, they get asked to sign forms that says they'll pay their bills. You know, if their insurance doesn't pay their bills, they won't sue the health system. But we don't actually ask them routinely, are you willing to donate your information, your tissue, your blood, to allow this massive biobank, if you will, for discovery? It's outstanding that there are examples of, say, the UK Biobank, et cetera, that are allowing those kind of platforms to evolve. And so we need more of that here in the US. And so making every patient count as they walk through the healthcare system and to provide a discovery platform for all.
Absolutely.
And I think also that, you know, every clinical trial is not created equal. And there are some really bad clinical trials, quite frankly, out there in terms of being built on robust phase 2, you know, data and science that tells us that this should move on to the next step. And biomarkers are not being used appropriately to ensure that it's not one size fits all. And so really changing up how we think about and design trials so that they truly match what patients need. And we're finding, you know, the right trial for the patient versus the patient for the trial. And I think that's a part of the problem.
You know, there are a couple of really great examples of meta collaborations now in clinical trial design and deployment. Lung MAP is one of them, the Lung Master Protocol. This is the FDA is involved, patient advocacy groups, Friends of Cancer Research, the NIH through the NCI, the Foundation of the National Institutes of Health, and 5 companies. I may be missing one, so it may be up to 6. But the idea is it's large companies, small companies, the FDA, patient advocacy, and a whole host of others. I mean, it's an honest meta collaboration that has designed a trial that in some ways course corrects the current design, which is you find some sites, you deploy the sites, a patient comes, they have inclusion and exclusion criteria. If they're excluded from the trial, they're done. I mean, there really isn't a, and these trials are beginning to say, well, we'll look at appropriateness to some arm in the trial, so it turns out to be an all-comers trial, which is a very different way to do this. And there are examples of this that are happening. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has announced something additionally. So there's now seems to be a move afoot to redesign to make it more fruitful and more meaningful for patients and to encourage participation and to not make the road to participate so terribly difficult.
Well, I think another aspect of those novel trial designs that's so critical, in addition to the patient involvement, is some of the issues with the discovery and the failures in the early stages arise because of those differences in the variability of response. Also, difficulty finding patients, particularly with rare conditions, where sites are essentially competing for trial A versus trial B. I think that was one of the most innovative aspects of the lung map trial, for instance, that you'd phenotype first, or genotype first, and then split folks up based on are they likely to respond to drug A or drug B. And so it's really a collaborative effort, but it includes the science and the patient engagement. I think those are all key. You know, I think another aspect of this, and of course the cure is the holy grail we're all looking for, but improvements in quality of life and daily living, the ability to go about your business, is one of the major mindset shifts I think that we're seeing as a result of patient engagement. In condition after condition after condition, we hear from patients, sure, mortality is important to me, but deal with this fatigue or this pain or whatever the symptom may be. And I think all of us are having a better appreciation for the impact of that. As patients or as care partners, caregivers for our family members, we've certainly seen how important that can be, particularly in certain conditions. And so I think the focus on patient-centered outcomes that matter most to patients, is also really critical. There's a lot of work going on in this area, of course, with PCORI, a lot of efforts in patient-reported outcomes and by a number of stakeholder groups. I think we're really starting to scratch the surface, though. There's so much more that can be done, and I think patient groups who are getting involved in this in their particular disease areas and their patient populations can really move the needle by helping us figure out how do we measure the impact on patients in a way that matters to patients. I think in the research enterprise, there's a tension between can we measure it systematically, consistently, repeatably, which is important just for making the research engine work, versus what's actually meaningful to this patient or that patient or that patient.
And do you think we've, kind of each of us kind of have touched about some of the barriers in actually communicating with patients, either kind of regulatory barriers or cultural barriers or the like? Are there any other kind of stark barriers that we might be able to tackle?
Well, it's
Go.
health literacy. And I think we have to remember that in America, less than 14% of people are truly highly health literate. And so we have to learn how to, first of all, improve health literacy across the board. And I think that's something that starts in school and builds forward. But we also have to remember to communicate in language and a style that people can actually access and understand. And there's obviously a lot of work going on in this, and I'm very impressed with what the CDC is doing in terms of health literacy, et cetera. But we have a long way to go, and that's why we need advocacy organizations and families and caretakers to really help be the middleware to translate what we're doing from a scientific medical perspective into things that actually help people interpret and understand the information that we have made available. Now, in my family, I've had way too many opportunities to be the middleware, and I'm highly medically trained, and yet I find it often very difficult to do that translation because it's coming at me in terms and in numbers that really are difficult to decipher and translate into a simplified approach to decision making.
Well, I had a patient tell me once early in my years, I've never forgotten it, I was spouting all kinds of, I was very officious, and I was saying, oh, well, 3% of patients who do this, and, so-and-so, and I'm, so good at this. And she was looking at me with a blank look, and she finally reached over and patted my hand. She said, Sugar, let me tell you, if it happens to me, it's 100%.
Right.
And so, so the understanding that all this little fancy footwork that we do does little to help people translate the risk-benefit for themselves and aid in their decision-making.
Well, along those same lines, I actually think clinician engagement is the same set of issues. So right now, there's this thing between patients and their data, and that's called a clinician. And so, how they become a part of the process that this is highly valuable to ensure that patients who want to be part of research to find the new cure are able to do that. You often hear clinicians talking about, well, my patients will only go into this trial. So just the start of that word, my patients, is wrong. And so, so there is this need to have clinician engagement so that they understand they're really part of this process and how to actually enable it and not become gatekeepers, and also to translate the results in ways people understand. So,
while it's certainly not uniform across diseases or conditions, I think the increase in use of patient decision aids and other shared decision-making tools can start to address some of these challenges. I think one of the interesting learnings I heard from a group, an industry and patient group consortium that was looking at gender disparities in clinical trials for cardiovascular was that a lot of the patients they surveyed said the first time I was ever asked to make a decision about my health was in regards to research participation. And how overwhelming must that be? You're being told there's uncertainty around this, we don't really know about the benefits and the risks, we don't know about the patient populations, but do you want to participate? And so, I think we can do more to support patient decision making. I think, the health literacy is certainly a challenge, but some of what we're seeing as part of our partnerships around the Patient Preference Initiative, which asks patients of these various benefit risk trade-offs, what are you willing to accept, is the use of patient decision aids in the actual clinical care setting between the physician and the patient, where you start by asking what's most important to you, and then based on that you structure the evidence that exists. And there are some savvy tools that are taking advantage of technology to present the data in ways that improve the health literacy or get around some of the health literacy issues for patients.
Your comment made me think about an urban legend story that I heard that begs the question, is there such thing as too much patient communication and activity? So you mentioned the blog. The urban legend was, right, the probably made up story to make the point. A patient was in a clinical trial. They were blogging with each other, and one patient stated that they changed the formulation of his medication, and he wrote it in the blog. And they asked, how would you know that? And he said, because when he used to flush it in the toilet, it floated, and now it sinks. So it's likely to be different. But the idea is, so thank you for that feedback, sir. But the idea is, does the sharing break the blind? Does it lead patients to do things that become potentially disruptive to the necessary science? And is that real or imagined? And if it's real, how are we managing it before we head into the lightning round?
I think one thing to recognize is that patients already share stories. And so, I don't know that anyone can control the internet, at least not that I know of. And so they share stories in their communities, and so if they're actually participating in research, they're sharing their experiences, and so we should embrace that. And there are a lot of other things that can, go wrong with trials. I mean, the comment that there's not a perfect trial, so to speak, is very true. And so, but if we have more openness and transparency around that, I think we'll learn. And there are a lot of ways to address those concerns.
I think one of the things that we assume is part of this, but we haven't really explicitly said, is that to have this patient-centered world, we need the patients engaged. And when you ask what's missing, I still find that to be one of the most overwhelming challenges, is how do we scale what we're doing? And it seems that there's just a voracious appetite for more data that's standardized and shared and informative. And that, to me, is one of the things I worry about the most. If we can, whether it's maintaining an investment in the basic science, generating the targets, figuring out the measures, having the patient community teed up to have the good fortune of having the right people in the right place to do the right trials at the right time, to me, it's just the velocity of continued investment in problem solving that I feel is still hard for us to really harness. And so that empowerment of the patients, and even thinking about the health literacy, really getting the patient community to appreciate the role that they can be playing as health citizens and being part of the solutions that they really want, that is still, I think, a pretty heavy lift. And 16 years into this, we think of 1 million patients in the US with Parkinson's disease, and we really still only know tens of thousands of them at the Fox Foundation. And we probably know more than anybody except for their pharmacy, the pharmacy chain. So this notion of really continuing to draw the patient into the process, I don't think is complete by any means.
Okay. All right, lightning round. One word or one phrase, call to action.
Ooh.
Okay, make it a sentence.
Okay, I think, grassroots organic notion of patient engagement is critical to culture change that sticks.
Yeah, great, love it.
So a congressional champion told me once, don't ever confuse legislative success with where the rubber hits the road. And I think that that's what we need to make sure is we need to make sure where the rubber hits the road that we're all in until we're there and not just checking the box that a patient's at the table.
Faster, focus, forward.
With alliteration, I'm loving it. Okay.
Break down these walls. We've built up piles and piles of data. That's not the problem. We can show that we can contact people. How do we scale? How do we get them to participate and break down those walls around institutions?
Perfect, thank you.
I think just relevance and the voice of the unmet need, but also the process and how we're going to meet those needs. There's a lot for us to be learning from the patient community about what they think they can bring to this process, but that it really is going to take so many different constituents to come together, and we can keep making progress.
I want to tip off of that for mine, which is what I refer to as meta-collaboration, all hands on deck, driving change forward. I think if we could amalgamate the work that we're doing, it would be quite incredible. So coming together in a meta-collaboration, I think, is a wonderful opportunity. So let me thank the panelists. I think they've done an amazing job of tackling. And to you for listening and participating with us this morning, and for all that you do every day to move this issue forward. So thank you, and I hope that this has started your day in a rousing manner. Take care.
Thank you.